Welcome back to the 57th online episode of Peacetime, hosted every Sunday morning by Peace Point, with myself, Phra Nicholas Thanissaro, live streaming from our meditation centre in London. Last time you saw me, we looked at blessing number 15 on practicing generosity. With the Dhamma talk today, we will move on in our series on enlightened living to the next blessing in the Pillar of Society subsection, namely blessing number 16 on Dhamma practice. So today's session will run to about an hour and 10 minutes, starting with a 20-minute talk about purging unwholesomeness from our past, then 30 minutes of meditation and 20 minutes to explain about upholding standards of good governance and purifying ourselves further still towards enlightenment. I should mention from the start that various aspects of today's topic of Dhamma practice have already been touched on in my earlier lectures, mostly B003 on the logic of karma and B004 on avoiding unwholesomeness from Buddhist concepts, but also lecture A021 on reluctant leadership. However, there are lots of new details I haven't talked about before, especially concerning prejudice and the virtues of a leader, so we have many new perspectives to explore today. The word used for blessing number 16 is Dhamma practice, or its Pali translation, Dhammacharya. The word is a compound of two terms, Dhamma and Charya. The word Dhamma, which you're probably familiar with, to some extent at least, comes usually with the capital D. It's hard to define it because it can have anything up to 40 different meanings. But for our purposes in the study of Buddhism, the Pali word Dhamma or Dharma in Sanskrit can be taken to mean correctness, goodness, purity, or what the Buddha taught. Sometimes the word Dhamma appears with a small d, in which case it would mean phenomena, which is a neutral term applied to both positive and negative things. For example, aging, sickness, and death are all Dhammas according to Buddhism. In English, we would capitalize Dhamma when it means goodness, purity, or the teaching of the Buddha, and leave it with a small d when it just refers to phenomena or mental phenomena. As for the word Charya, this means conduct. The two terms combined together as Dhammacharya mean the practice of good deeds or correct practice. Dhamma practice is essentially about becoming pure. We will come to the sort of deeds that are good or correct in more detail in a moment. However, to give a practical idea for the purposes of this blessing, we can say that it is the sort of deeds and conduct which promote our sense of responsibility for human dignity on three levels: the personal level, the interpersonal level, and the level of society and the economy. In this particular blessing, we will concentrate mainly on personal and interpersonal levels of human dignity because we will see more of human dignity on the economic level in blessing 18 that talks about blameless work and blessing 19 that talks about not consuming intoxicants. In essence, Dhamma practice is intended to achieve two goals. Firstly, to purge oneself from the effects of any unwholesomeness we have done in our past, and secondly, at the very least, to conform with standards of good governance in life, or better still, to double down on our existing purity, which you might call sanctification. The Buddha positioned Dhamma practice as number 16 in the series of blessings because it needs to be mastered before we can successfully deal with blessings about looking after one's extended family and blameless work. The rationale behind this is that looking after one's extended family and blameless work can be ethical minefields because they force us to work alongside people of possibly dubious dispositions in a wider society. Without particular caution in our dealings, we run the risk of spoiling our good intentions or coming into conflict by taking sides. This is why, before embarking on works of social value, we have to prepare ourselves by studying the impartiality in worldly and spiritual work, so as not to bring inadvertent harm to ourselves or others. So before we look at how Buddhists can do Dhamma practice to purge themselves of any unwholesomeness in their past, perhaps it's useful to draw a comparison with how other religions deal with the same issue. In Christianity, especially Catholicism, if a Christian breaks a commandment, they will go to confession with a priest in the church. To unburden themselves before death, a priest would be called to administer last rites. In that way, it's believed that they can be alleviated of their sins. In Hinduism, there's also a way of purification, bathing in the Ganges on full moon days. Hindus believe they can rinse away their sins with river water. Sin is treated as if it's a sort of physical dirt that can be washed away by the holy waters of the river Ganges. In its approach to purification, Buddhism is rather different from the other religions that I've already mentioned, because Buddhism does not concern itself with purging sin or the accumulation of bad deeds in the past, but with purging oneself of the impurities in the mind that might cause the intention to commit further such sins in the future. This purging is a sequential process and works on 3 levels, rather like the way gold is purified from its naturally occurring deposits. There is a simile in the Pamsuttovaka Sutta of the Anguttara Nikaya that when smelting gold, you need to work your way through the impurities, starting with the gross ones, moving on to the medium ones, and finishing up with the subtle ones. Buddhism recommends using the precepts on the gross level, meditation on the medium level, and wisdom on the subtle level. At this stage in the blessings, we are dealing with the coarse or gross levels of impurities. If it were someone panning for gold, then it would be the coarse sand and fine grit. The prospector would have to rinse the gold again and again until they've washed all the sand and grit away. In Buddhism, this function would be by keeping the precepts, or more extensively, the fulfillment of the 10-fold path of wholesomeness. As for the 2nd and 3rd levels of purification, well, we will return to them in blessings later on in the series. What's important for Buddhism is that there is not the belief that a supernatural being or even the Buddha can somehow magic away the bad things we've done in our past. And on the subject of trying to wash away our sins in the sacred waters of a river, the Buddha had a whole conversation with a Brahmin called Sankarapa, with his own eponymous sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya that trying to wash away one's sins would be like washing the outside of a cooking pot when there is still a lot of dirt stuck on the inside. In other words, our problem is on the inside, in other words, in our mind, and it's not water we need, but changes to our mental habits if we want to make a difference there. On the subject of confession, it should be acknowledged that this practice also has an important role in Buddhism too, mostly in the monastic community, but it's from the point of view of declaring one's intention to renew one's effort to overcome unwholesomeness after having broken a precept. But it's not really seen as a way of overcoming the consequences of the evil already done. Supposing Mr. A punches Mr. B on the nose and subsequently confesses it to a spiritual mentor, Buddhists would see this as helping Mr. A to feel better about it and hopefully to avoid repeating his behavior. But the act of contrition doesn't help Mr. B feel any better about his swollen nose. So Buddhists at least feel that even on a superficial level, the consequences of an action are not lessened by confession. Therefore, Buddhists have their own particular way of understanding the purging of past unwholesomeness. On our path of self-development via the 38 blessings of life, there are many reasons on many levels of description why to purify oneself is attractive. On a personal level, it would mean bolstering the strengths in our character while recognizing and uprooting any known weaknesses in our character. On an interpersonal level, it would mean building on our strengths and the quality of relationships we have with other people. On a social level, it wouldn't mean going on a protest march, but rather overcoming in ourselves the weaknesses and inequalities that are often so obvious in our modern society, by being one less person who is prone to corruption, nepotism, and fraud, while displaying the sort of compassion which makes our society a more pleasant place to live in. Rather than concentrating on how we feel about our past or the physical residue of the unwholesomeness in our past, the Buddha concentrated on the residue of evil deeds left as defilements in the mind. The only real hope for purging bad stuff in our past might be referred to in Buddhism as dilution rather than absolution. Usually, the only way in which karmic retribution becomes defunct is by giving its fruit. But rather than just sitting and waiting for one's karma to run out, the Buddha suggested two ways to purify oneself, namely the indirect way of diluting old bad karma with large quantities of new good karma, and the more direct uprooting of the old bad karma through meditation and wisdom. The second method for the medium and subtle defilements is something we will come back to in Blessings 31 and 32 through the practices of austerity and chastity. But at this early stage in the blessings, when we are still focused on the more indirect method of dilution, supposing you compare the negative things in our past to a spoonful of salt, and you compare the positives in life to a container of water, supposing you put the spoonful of salt in a glass of water. If you taste the water, it will still have a salty taste. If you put the same amount of salt in a bucket of water, though, then you will find that although the water still tastes a little bit salty, but it tastes a lot less so. But what would happen if you put a spoonful of salt in a huge water tank? Now, even if you drink the water, you will no longer be able to detect the salty taste, even though the salt is still there. In the same way, although we may have many things we've done in our past which we regret, we can start afresh in our lives by doing so many positive things in our lives that the old negative things become insignificant by comparison. The water for dilution is gained by living up to the ideals of the tenfold path of wholesomeness, which I already mentioned in passing in blessing number 9, and which in Pali is known as the Kusala Dhammapatha, consisting of absolutely not killing, absolutely not stealing, absolutely not committing adultery, absolutely not telling lies, absolutely not engaging in malicious gossip, absolutely not speaking harshly, absolutely not engaging in idle chatter, absolutely not thinking to take the possessions of others, absolutely removing ourselves from vengefulness, and absolute possession of right view. Getting to this tenfold path of wholesomeness starts with boosting our sense of responsibility for our own human dignity by avoiding the so-called defilements of action. These are the main behaviors of word and deed that indicate a person is unscrupulous or constantly takes advantage of other people, either in their presence or behind their backs. In other words, they have no sense of conscience. So, if impurity consists of taking advantage of others, then purity should come from what would be known in Thai Buddhist culture as the 5 virtues, or Pancha Dhamma, which builds on the virtues of abstaining from the 4 defilements of action. Although I've mentioned these in passing before, today I'll go into a little more detail about each of the 5 virtues that help to dilute the salt of any unwholesomeness we have in our past. And you will note that the 5 are the diametric opposite, or the flip side, of breaking the 5 precepts. The first of the 5 virtues is compassion, which means making sure we are presentable, well-spoken, and courteous, expressing concern for others, having good manners, going out of our way to help others, and not doing things to arouse others' suspicion. The second of the 5 virtues is generosity, which means giving others resources, time, forgiveness, attention, teaching, and advice, all the details of which we've already spoken about in the previous blessing. The third of the 5 virtues is contentment with one's lawfully wedded. This means being faithful to one's partner where applicable and actively practicing the virtues that keep a marriage going, as we have seen in Blessing 13. The fourth of the 5 virtues is truthfulness in everything we say, honesty to ourselves, earnestness in every task we do, especially towards the cultivation of good deeds. It also means training ourselves to do better than best in every task that comes our way. We need to make sure that we are authentic, both within ourselves and towards other people. The fifth and final of the 5 virtues is mindfulness, which at its simplest means training ourselves to keep the mind at the center of the body the whole of the time, whether we have our eyes closed for meditation or open for other duties we attend to in our life. We need to keep up the habit of meditation to give ourselves the mental momentum to keep our mindfulness going, despite any problems that may crop up in our life. Cultivating any or all of these virtues will also help add the proverbial clean water to rinse away the salt from our past unwholesome deeds and change our mind from negative to positive on a more regular basis. Even if we have negative things in our past or things we've done and which we now regret, by building up more and more positive deeds in all the ways I've already mentioned, will allow us to dilute the regrets and anxieties we have in our minds. So before we come to time for meditation today, there's time for a quick story. It's said that longevity is one of the marks of a person who is pure or who is established in the tenfold path of wholesomeness. And to this end, there is a story of when the Buddha went back to visit his father, King Suddhodana. The king informed his son that he had heard the rumor that his son had already died as a result of his practice of self-mortification. However, the king had not believed the rumor. He had had more confidence in his own son than that. The Buddha told him that this was not the first time that the king had shown such confidence in him as a son. In a previous lifetime, when the Bodhisattva had been studying in a town far away from home with his teacher Disapamokha, a young fellow student died. The Bodhisattva informed his teacher in an offhand comment that where he lived, no one younger than 100 years old could die, even by misadventure. The teacher didn't believe the Bodhisattva, so he decided to investigate for himself. He took some goat's bones and carried them in a sack to the Bodhisattva's father, saying that he had returned the bones of his son who had passed away in the course of his studies. At that time, the Bodhisattva's father did not believe the teacher. Not even the other villagers would believe him and laughed out loud in his face. The reason why everyone in that village was so long-lived was that for 7 generations everyone in the village had been practicing all of the tenfold path of wholesomeness I described earlier, that are the wellspring of the purifying water that can dilute away all the unwholesome salt from our past karmic history. So now that we know a little bit more about the practices to eradicate impurities from our past, let's take a few moments to further our spiritual purity in the here and now by settling ourselves for 30 minutes of meditation, which today is a recent live recording of 5 good reasons to meditate. If at this time you would like to find a comfortable sitting position for yourself as you listen to my guidance. So if you'd like to start by adopting a comfortable position for yourself in meditation, closing your eyes and allow your shoulders to drop. Make sure your eyes are closed only very gently, and invite the inner gaze to soften, bringing your awareness back within yourself and allowing your awareness to soften as well. From there we relax every muscle of our body. We relax every muscle, starting with the muscles of our forehead, our eyebrows and our eyelids, making sure our eyes are only very gently closed. We never squeeze our eyes closed, but close our eyes gently in the same way we might close our eyes to go to sleep. should be sure that there's no heaviness on our eyelids. And if we notice that our eyes are closed too tightly, or if there is any heaviness on our eyelids, then we may need to open our eyes and close them again more gently. Closing our eyes in just the same way we would close them to go to sleep. From there we relax the muscles of our face. We relax our neck, both shoulders, both arms, all the way down to our hands and our fingers. Continuing on down, we relax our chest, trunk and abdomen, relaxing both legs, all the way down to our feet and our toes. So that all the way, right the way from the top of our head down to the tips of our toes. There's no remaining part of our body with any sort of stress or tension anymore. If we do notice any tension remaining in our body, then we do our best to relax it completely. Because if our body is completely relaxed, we'll be left with a feeling as if our body seems to melt away into the atmosphere around us. And we'll have no more worries about our body anymore. From there we can turn to relaxation of our mind or our mental state. We do this by letting go of any thoughts we may have about the past or the future. We let go of any thoughts about our responsibilities, or perhaps pertaining to any labels we identify within life, whether it be our name, our age, our gender. Just letting all of that fall away. You let go of any labels concerning our relationships to others. Letting go of all these ideas of self, and instead we allow ourselves to just be. To just be the awareness. To just be in the here and now. It may involve letting go of any narratives we may have of who we are, or our past, or our future, our to-do list, or of who we want to be. We just remain aware in the present moment, accepting that there's nothing to do and nowhere to be. There's just being. If there are any thoughts, then we just allow them to come and go, watching them without attachment, with no need to intervene, here in the stillness, surrendering into this space of nothing and no one, not being anyone, but just being. And conjuring up a sense of happiness and joy in the mind, perhaps casting our mind back to a time in our life when we felt truly happy, as if that feeling were composed of tiny particles of happiness and joy, completely filling our body and mind, and allowing that feeling of joy and happiness to leave us feeling refreshed on the inside, and cherishing that feeling of happiness and joy for a few moments, as if all the happiness were radiating outward from the center of our body, allowing us to merge with the totality of our surroundings, and just remaining for a few moments in that stillness, the stillness of this space. And inside our body we imagine is just an empty space, or as if our whole body has been transformed somehow into a sort of bubble with nothing on the inside. Or equally it might be as if our body has disappeared altogether, leaving nothing but a great empty space. But we allow our mind to reconnect with that special place inside us, which feels like the point of greatest contentment. Somewhere around the area of our diaphragm, while maintaining our attention there as continuously as we can, for as long as we can, not letting our attention slip away to anything else. If we already have an inner object of some sort, we can adopt that as the focus for our meditation. But if we don't seem to have anything obvious to focus upon, we can always start by conjuring up one of our own, a visual object or one that we can feel inside us. And if our attention wanders away to other things, we simply bring it back again as soon as we realize. Bringing it back repeatedly until, little by little, keeping the mind centered becomes like second nature to us. We remain always at the center of whatever we can perceive inside us, not as if we were looking down on that point, but as if we were actually down there ourselves. So as if we have shifted the whole of our mental office down from the level of our brain to that place at the center of our stomach, with all perception, memory, thought and cognition in the same place at our center, actually within the object that we perceive. If thoughts return, we do our best to ignore them, to let them die down, to leave a sense of silence in the mind, silence in which there's nothing but our inner object as the total focus for our attention. And if we rest our mind gently, continuously, there'll be a sense in which it's almost like threading a needle. So an extreme lightness of touch that can allow the mind to reach through to the other side. If we can achieve this level of finesse, we'll start to see the center of the body as much more than just being a point in the mind, but actually something more like a trailhead, or a pathway that leads the mind deeper. As for the possible problem of there being thoughts in the mind, if the thoughts are at a low level, you can generally get away with just ignoring them by not encouraging the thoughts. In this way, we'll find that a first thought will no longer lead to a second or a third, but it will die down into silence. But for some people, it may be that the thoughts don't just go away quite as easily as that, in which case we may need to take it to the next level by making use of that mantra, the thought-blocking strategy I taught you earlier, which is to hear the sound of the words Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, or your own equivalent, coming up as if you hear those words like a silent music, coming from the source of a sound located at the center of your body. Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, over and over again, lightly, gently, continuously, until at a certain point in your meditation you'll start to find that the thoughts have died down. You may find yourself forgetting the mantra because it's not necessary for you anymore. So if the mantra dies down in this way, then all we need to do is be content to remain in silence, with nothing but that inner object at the center of ourselves. So we cultivate our attention in this way, lightly and gently, keeping our mind on track by means of our inner object, while discouraging any thoughts from arising in the mind, and touching gently with the center of our inner experience, allowing the mind to go deeper inside for a few more moments now in silence until we come to the appropriate time. And we continue to keep our mind on track at the center of the body the whole of the time. Lightly, gently and continuously. If our attention wanders off onto other things, each time we realize, we simply bring our attention gently back again to the center of our body as before. If the inner object disappears, we can conjure up a new one. But if it changes, we just follow it in its new form. If thoughts arise in the mind, we do our best to ignore them. We make use of the mantra if the thoughts in the mind are too many simply to be ignored. At the same time, we take special care to get the balance right in our meditation, applying the mind at the center of the body, neither with too much force nor too little. Be our mind in place at the center with nothing more than a feather-light touch. Until we can start to build up a sense of lightness and expansion in our meditation, it is the sign that we have reached the sweet spot in our meditation practice. There are many potential benefits that can come of our meditation, but at the same time, reading about meditation in the mass media can often lead us to a rather underwhelming perspective on what meditation can do for us. Even the word visualization is often misunderstood to be some sort of manifesting or about getting the things that you want in life. But in fact, meditation has benefits that are much deeper than that. And more authentic goals of meditation should at the very least include things like bringing the mind back inside the space of the body and helping to overcome problems in our lives, helping us to gain a spiritual refuge while understanding the nature of life and overcoming the impurities in our mind. In order to bring the mind back inside the space of the body, we need to internalize the mind while shaking ourselves free of the influences in the outside world, all the things that come to us via our 5 external senses. For overcoming problems in our life, meditation has a special characteristic that it allows us to gain a sort of headspace, taking off the pressure in our lives, giving us a feeling of lightness and happiness or solace in our lives. A space in which we can start to get perspective on the true roots of any problems occurring in our lives, while giving us the motivation to overcome those difficulties in our lives. From the point of view of being a refuge in our lives, when meditation draws the mind inwards towards something known as inner peace, we start to gain a feeling of safety and confidence in our lives, which is an important reason to build up a regular meditation habit in our lives, to give us that sense of confidence from the inside. just for the benefit of understanding life more deeply and learning about who we really are. Meditation gives us a perspective by which we can start to see how life really is. To be able to look beyond the suffering and the impermanence, and to prevent us from becoming attached to an illusory ego. The sort of perspective change that we can gain in this way allows us to have more realistic expectations about life in a way that minimizes the shadows of suffering. And for the last important benefit of meditation, which is to overcome any of those mental impurities in the mind, whether it be greed or hatred or delusion, then we have to be able to actually identify these things in our mind first of all before we can overcome them. It's not a work that someone else can do for us. And it's not something that we can do if we don't understand the nature of our own minds first of all. But being able to stand back from those impurities to see the nature of the pure mind, to give us that contrast. This is something that meditation enables for us. So these are 5 important reasons why meditation is something we ought to practice regularly in our lives, in order that day by day we can gradually work towards that clarity and wisdom, purity within ourselves. So we continue to meditate in this way now for a few more moments in silence, lightly and gently on track at the center of our body, before we come to time for practicing some loving-kindness meditation together. Continue to keep our mind on track at the center of the body the whole of the time, lightly, gently, and continuously. Always at the center of whatever inner experience we have built up for ourselves as a result of the meditation so far this evening. For some of us, the inner experience may consist of a sense of brightness on the inside, inner illumination, in which case we place our mind very gently at the center of that illumination in a way that it can spread gradually outwards from the place of contact at the center of ourselves, in rather the same way that newly fallen snow might melt away when touched with a warm fingertip, with solid becoming liquid, or liquid becoming vapor, expanding outwards from the point of contact. For some people, the inner experience may be more of a feeling, a sense of well-being located around the center of ourselves. In the same way, we would touch gently at the center of that feeling, allowing the feeling to spread outwards from that central point. For others still, the inner experience may consist in some sort of inner imagery, objects in the mind, large or small. We spread loving kindness to ourselves, first of all, because if we have no compassion for ourselves, then it's going to be hard for us to have compassion for anyone else. Initially, we extend the loving kindness, expanding it to fill the whole of our own body, while making the gentle affirmation at the center of ourselves that may we be well and happy, may we be free from suffering. And then allowing the loving kindness to extend outwards beyond the boundaries of our own body, outwards into the room around us, almost like an halo or an aura, extending outwards in all directions, taking in all the living beings around us, whether they be people or sentient beings, extending loving kindness to all of them too, without exception, while making the gentle affirmation at the center of ourselves that may all these living beings in the room be well and happy, free from suffering, live together in peace and harmony. And again, from our center, we extend the radius of our loving kindness ever outwards, wider and wider, outwards into the neighborhood, the whole town and borough, county, country, beyond the borders of this country, to the whole continent, wider still to all the continents of the world. We extend our loving kindness as far as we can, without feeling that we are forcing it at all. And wherever we can extend our loving kindness, we extend our compassion to all those living beings with the wish that they be well and happy, free from suffering, live together in peace and harmony, so that peace might become a reality on our planet within our own lifetimes. For the last few moments of our loving kindness meditation, we can also extend loving kindness to particular loved ones, towards those for whom we feel a sense of gratitude, towards those still living or to those who have already passed, with the trust that our pure intention can reach across the gulfs of space and time to reach those loved ones wherever they are to be found. We extend our loving kindness in this way for the last few moments of our meditation practice together, until we come to the appropriate time. Sabba Buddhanupavena, Sabba Dhammanupavena, Sapa Sankhanupavena Sattha Soti Bhavantu Te. So if you'd like to come to the end of your meditation for today, and you can gradually open your eyes again. If you feel at all uncomfortable, then slowly try changing to a more comfortable position before gently finishing your practice. So to come gently back to our subject matter of Dhamma practice for today, we consider how the virtues we practice can be not just a pathway out of past unwholesomeness, but also behavior in accordance with what is pure and the wellspring of ever-increasing purity for ourselves in the future as well. Sometimes this is referred to as the aspect of pure practice, and mostly it pertains to our habits. The habits of people who live together in groups on the level of the family, society, or country add up to dictate the collective prosperity or deterioration of that community. So the habits we end up with have usually brushed off on us from those in our human environment, especially those in the 6 sectors of society mentioned in the Sigalovada Sutta. Many of the duties and habits fulfilled in the 6 directions have already been touched upon in our journey through the 38 blessings already, whether it be friends' duties to each other that we saw in the 2nd blessing, the clergy's duties to their congregation that we saw in blessing number 3, the students' and teachers' duties to each other that we saw in blessing 7, our duties in looking after our parents that we saw in blessing 11, our duties to raising children properly that we saw in blessing 12, our marital duties that we saw in blessing 13, the congregation's duties in support of their spiritual mentors that we saw in blessing 15, and duties between employer and employee that we'll see in the workplace when we come to blessing number 18. If we were to put the overview of habit formation into one single graphic, we would end up with a triangle like this one that tries to show the process of habit formation all the way from being an upstanding member of society to becoming a pillar of society. To change ourselves, society, and humanity for the better, we have to transform the habits of the members of society for the better, starting with our own. The most important habit is being responsible on 3 levels of description: our own sense of human dignity, self in the diagram, responsibility for the human dignity of others, SOC in the diagram, and responsibility for the human dignity as part of a fair economic system, or econ in the diagram. We will come back to the economic aspect in future blessings. From the last slide, you can see that the influence of doing right by the 6 directions are like the rainfall of influence of our habits that guides us from above, at least in the diagram, providing us with ENV, which stands for a positive human environment for pure habit formation. From ENV, the next stop on the journey is working with human dignity on our individual level or self in the diagram, where the 4 defilements of action need to be avoided. 4 defilements of action, or Gammakilesa, are 4 impure behaviors which you will recognize from the 10-fold path of wholesomeness that I mentioned earlier, namely killing people or animals, or paranatipata, stealing or taking that which is not given, or adinadana, adultery or sexual misconduct, or gamesu misachara, and finally telling lies, or musawata. Anyone who can abstain from the 4 defilements of action can be said to respect their own sense of human dignity because they neither harm others nor take advantage of them. You'll notice that these 4 forms of behavior are diametrically opposite to the decent behaviors described in the moral code of most religions. In Buddhism, restraint from these behaviors is covered in the first 4 of the 5 precepts. Even the 5 precepts is well known to be the underlying virtue that underpins our sense of humanity. If we want to stay human, in other words, remain humane or respect our own human dignity, then it's necessary to live our lives according to the 5 precepts. otherwise we will descend into savagery or give in to animal urges. The missing fifth precept on abstaining from consuming intoxicants doesn't appear in the 4 defilements of action, but returns later at blessing number 19. But for today, responsibility for human dignity on the personal level, illustrated by the self node in the diagram, means being responsible for preserving our own sense of human dignity or humanity rather than behaving like a savage by not killing, stealing, cheating on a trusting spouse or partner, and not telling lies. Moving on from self, we come to sok, which represents responsibility for human dignity of others in society, which according to Buddhism means the 4 forms of bias. Bias because of desire, bias because of hatred, bias because of ignorance, and bias because of fear. First sort of bias is bias because of desire or chantagati. For example, parents who don't love their children equally because of favoritism may treat their children unfairly. The second sort of bias is bias because of hatred or dosagati. For example, teachers suffering from bias based on hatred or anger will behave unfairly towards annoying students, perhaps awarding them less than their due grades. The third sort of bias is bias because of ignorance or mohagati. For example, someone who suffers from bias because of ignorance may take decisions based on their own stupidity or lack of information, or put someone unscrupulous or incompetent in a position of responsibility. The fourth sort of bias is bias because of fear or bayagati. Usually we think of a fearful person as someone to be pitied, but they can also be a person who can make decisions that seriously lack good judgment. For example, someone who's biased because of fear might bear false witness under duress against someone they know is innocent. All forms of bias or prejudice cause us to trample the dignity of the innocent. Trampling dignity through bias starts with trampling one's own dignity by twisting the truth in one's own heart and mind. Such bias in our minds then twists the things we say or do to deviate from what is pure and just. The way Buddhists see it is that bias can undermine a person's responsibility towards human dignity, whether it is merely latent in a person's mind or if it's expressed in unjust actions. Bias can impede our cultivation of virtue because it might cause us to perceive a gift made out of gratitude as being no more than a bribe. If we could trust that the world were free of bias, it would make it much simpler to cultivate good deeds without having to be constantly suspicious of ulterior motives. Anyone who can abstain from all 4 forms of bias is someone who is in a good position to uphold justice, and knowing about the subconscious origins of prejudice should help us to avoid infringing the rights of others, twisting the truth, or bearing false witness. It should help us to avoid thinking that we are above the law, everyone else has to follow, and therefore, to a greater or lesser extent, to be a person with social responsibility. A third facet of Dhamma practice is behaving in accordance with what is pure or just, not letting our mental impurities or temptations interfere with what we know to be good or fair. If you are in a leadership position or as a pillar of society, it behooves you to maintain a certain standard of moral caliber. In the Buddhist scriptures, the sort of leaders that are idealized are those who can uphold the 10 virtues of a ruler, otherwise known as the Raja Dhamma. These standards of moral caliber are supposed to apply to both monarchs and presidents alike, although generally a monarch will stay in power as long as they live, whereas a president will have a limited length of office. Mostly it doesn't go into detail about despotic acts like rewriting the constitution to keep your own opponents out of power or undermining democratic or human rights. It applies more to the sort of leader that people would be happy to see continue in power. So the 10 virtues of a ruler deal mostly with personal qualities, those qualities of the sort of person who might in the present day be referred to as a philosopher king. The qualities particularly mentioned are generosity or dana, self-discipline or sila, self-sacrifice or parichaka, integrity or ajawa, gentleness or matawa, austerity or tapa, non-anger or akota, non-violence or avihingsa, patience or kanti, non-deviation from righteousness or avirodhana. Of course, if a ruler is able to conduct themselves in accordance with these 10 virtues of a ruler, the country or kingdom and all its subjects will prosper. In ancient times, according to the Buddhist scriptures, such exemplary rulers existed at certain times in history and were known as universal monarchs or Chakravartin. They were seen as the sort of secular counterpart of the Buddha and are also found in the scriptures of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism. They are the sort of monarchs which had such a good reputation that people of neighboring territories would come along and petition them to come and rule their territory as well, until the whole world became united without borders. To give an illustrated example of the sort of things that could be expected of a truly just ruler, according to the Buddhist scriptures, the benefits of pure governance go much further than a happy populace. In the 334th Jataka, called the Rajavata Jataka, there was once a king of Benares who wasn't making a very good job of governing his kingdom. To find out what was wrong, he sneaked out of the palace and travelled about in disguise, and in the course of his wanderings came to the Himalayas, where the Bodhisattva lived as an ascetic. The ascetic gave him ripe figs, but no matter which tree he picked them from, the king found that all the figs tasted bitter. He asked the Bodhisattva, who in that lifetime was the ascetic, why the figs were so bitter, and, unaware that the subject of the conversation was standing right in front of him, the ascetic explained to him that the present ruler was failing to rule in accordance with the 10 virtues of a ruler. The king thanked the Bodhisattva and snuck back to his palace. From that time on, he tried much harder to rule his kingdom in accordance with the 10 virtues of a ruler, and several years later, when he had the chance to return to the same mountain hermitage, when he picked figs from the same trees he had sampled all those years ago, he found this time that they all tasted sweet. This time the Bodhisattva explained needlessly that the change had come about since the king of the country had started ruling his kingdom justly, and this time the king returned to his palace feeling vindicated. A similar parable is given in the 396th Jataka, called the Kuku Jataka, which tells of one of the Buddha's previous births as a counselor who needed to speak truth to power, since his monarch at the time, called King Brahmadatta, was an unjust ruler who used to extort taxes or extract taxes from his subjects by violent means. Afraid of the king's temper, the Bodhisattva had waited tactfully for a long time for the opportunity to correct the king's ways. One day, however, the opportunity presented itself when the king and the councillor were visiting a building under construction in the royal park. The roofing was not complete, and the rafters had just been laid in place. The king asked his councillor how the rafters could stay in place, and having found his opportunity, the councillor said that just as the peak of the roof will fall unless tightly held by the rafters, a king will soon fall from power unless supported by subjects who have been won over by his righteousness. Understanding the parable, from that time forth the king behaved much more justly in the way he received taxes from his subjects. Often we feel pretty smug about our human rights record in the West, with the attitude that injustice and atrocities could never happen here. But often, if we know the telltale signs, we would recognize that we can never afford to be complacent, even in an advanced democracy. According to an exhibition I saw at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, the early warning signs of human rights starting to be compromised in any society are marked by ghettoization, when a particular social group is forced to relocate, often to a neglected area. A second early warning sign is the labeling of groups with a symbol or being forced to carry identity papers. Sometimes even their homes are marked. The third early warning sign is the defamation of particular social groups. Characteristically, they are referred to as disloyal or subhuman, perhaps being referred to as rats or cockroaches. Often the paranoia is stoked to justify human rights abuses, is marked by the stockpiling of weapons without any evidence for any existential threat to the country. The victims of human rights abuses are sometimes subjected to a slow death by disruption of drinking water, sanitation, or other vital services. Often, human rights abuses are indicated in interference in reproductive rights of a suppressed social group to limit their numbers. And finally, and least subtly, there may be a destruction of cultural or religious artifacts. Institutions belonging to that social group are desecrated, and influential people in that group are targeted by threats, imprisonment, or disappearances. Perhaps their leaders or those of military age. Of course, governments or nations can confront the perpetration of atrocities. Nonetheless, it's also important that individuals avoid ending up as bystanders or collaborators to a system that perpetuates injustice. In a quote that is usually attributed to John Stuart Mill, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Speaking out or helping those targeted by violence or injustice is the only difference between a bystander and an upstander. In fact, it is a rare person who does something about injustice before that injustice starts to affect them personally. So in order to go beyond mere awareness of the way our prejudices can affect our subconscious, we also need to be aware of the reasons why people who witness injustice fail to do something about it, so that we can keep up with any lack of resolve that might compromise our true sense of respect for human dignity, a sense of dignity that is needed for us to become a pillar of society, rather than someone who is just along for the ride. The first thing compromising any resolve may be fear. Some people feel they have to go along with perpetrators of injustice in order to protect themselves. The second possible reason for going along with injustice is personal or economic gain in allowing others to be victimized. A third reason for going along with injustice is blind obedience, because some people just do what they're told by an authority figure and are afraid to rock the boat. A fourth reason for going along with injustice is prejudice, for all the four reasons I've already mentioned, often stoked by propaganda which reaffirms a person's existing prejudices. A fifth reason for going along with injustice is that people don't know what else to do. Often people do nothing because they don't believe they can make a difference. And the final reason for going along with injustice is that no one else seems to be helping. No one else stands up, it's easier for others to justify doing nothing. And although Buddhists don't naively expect that society would be completely equal in all respects, none of these 6 excuses for tolerating injustice of opportunity would be seen as befitting of a bodhisattva trying to lead all living beings toward nirvana. Of course, it's not easy to initiate and sustain Dhamma practice in our life. 2 of the main obstacles are lack of morale and negative surroundings. Some try to practice but give up too easily because they lack morale. In such a case, it is useful to associate more closely with those who are supportive of our cultivation of wholesomeness and justice in life. Otherwise, even if you start out motivated, you can be drained by a negative environment that doesn't allow you to live up to your ideals. Sometimes it can be to do with an unsupportive family or the nature of the work we do for a living. The important thing is not to let perfect be the enemy of good. Even if you are only able to keep 5 precepts 1 day a week, it still gives the mind the chance to rest from unwholesomeness and reduces the toll of negativity in the mind. The important thing is to do good deeds whenever you have the opportunity, while trusting that when it comes to the right time, more conducive opportunities will present themselves. In this imperfect world in which we are trying to strive towards whatever is pure, 4 sensible pieces of advice would be to be selective about our career path, to avoid shoddiness and prejudice, and of course to meditate regularly. For the aspect of being selective about our career path, although we will come back to this in Right Livelihood again in blessing number 18, if you are able to choose the sort of work where you can avoid having to put yourself in a negative situation every day of the week, you need to be choosy about the work you do by avoiding making profit out of the suffering of other people or sentient beings. At the same time, whatever craft you turn your hand to, you should never turn in shoddy work. Always do things to the best of your ability, whatever task comes to hand. This thoroughness will carry over when you come to work on yourself spiritually. An example of this might be a monk preparing proper notes and references for a sermon rather than simply making it up as they go along. A third practical aspect of Dhamma practice in everyday life is to police your own attitudes for bias or prejudice. For example, I know that I'm racially prejudiced. It is a byproduct of growing up while taking white privilege for granted. These days, I would also be accused of cultural appropriation in spite of being a white Euro, but dressing up in saffron robes and shaving off all my hair in an attempt to be more acceptable to Asians. Nonetheless, I am at least aware of my blind spots, and I do my best to find out more about the issues, to read about the lived experiences of Black, Latin, or Asian authors, and challenge my own attitudes to become more woke when appropriate. If you, like me, realize that you have somewhere to go in uprooting the blind spots of prejudice from the mind, 6 useful pieces of advice which might help you in this respect are: firstly, to consciously commit yourself to egalitarianism. Secondly, to recognize the unconscious bias is no more the real you than your conscious values. You are both the unconscious and the conscious. Thirdly, you need to acknowledge differences rather than pretend you are ignoring them. Fourthly, you may need to seek out friendship with people from different groups in order to get outside your bubble and increase your brain's familiarity with diverse perspectives while expanding your point of view. Fifth, it's natural to focus on how people are different from you, but try to consciously identify with what qualities and goals you may have in common. Lastly, when you encounter examples of ambiguous bias, you need to speak out against them, because that will help you to create and reinforce a standard for yourself and the people around you, in addition to providing some help to those who are the targets of explicit and implicit prejudice. Lastly, no matter how smart you are, without meditating regularly, you have no chance of being successful in your pursuit of the tenfold path of wholesomeness. The reason is that even though people know they have bad habits, without meditation they will lack the depth of motivation to do something about it. And I will add that although with all I've said up to this point about leaders needing to be the ones to stand up against injustice and take a stand on issues, with the addition of meditation as part of the practicality of Dhamma practice, you may find that in some cases the best executive choice may be to practice equanimity, especially where taking sides in an argument may be counterproductive. And this may especially be the case when you are about to make some breakthrough in your meditation, and the best choice you can make for your long-term spiritual furtherment is to give yourself a few moments more of inward focus rather than to go marching out into the world to right everyone's wrongs. For today, I would like to finish off with a Jataka story which illustrates the conflict between governance and the transcendental values of those who aspire to the pathway towards nirvana. There was a particular lifetime which is related to the 538th Jataka called the Mahanipata or Mukupaka Jataka, where the Bodhisattva is born as Prince Tamiya. His father was the king of Kasi in India. The father wanted to groom the young prince for kingship from an early age, so he let the baby lie in his lap when he was in court, pronouncing death sentences on criminals brought before him. Even as a small child, since Tamiya had already been cultivating perfections for countless lifetimes, he was able to recall past lives where he too had been a king pronouncing death sentences on others, and as a result he had suffered the retribution of 20,000 years in the unfortunate realms. In order to avoid history repeating itself, he hatched a plan to avoid being fit for governance. From that day forth, he feigned dumbness to avoid having to take the throne. They tried everything to get the prince to speak, including punishment on one hand and temptation on the other. Everything, however, failed, and since the royals did not want someone with a speech impairment to sully its lineage, they decided to destroy the evidence. So when Tamiya reached the age of 16, his execution was ordered. Even this did not cause him to speak up, as he would prefer to die than to create more bad karma. Nonetheless, as his grave was being dug, he did find his tongue and spoke to the man called Sunanda who was digging his grave. He asked Sunanda just to let him go and tell the royal family that the prince was already dead and buried. Sunanda was overcome by compassion for the prince and released him on the condition that he went and became an ascetic. Nonetheless, as an ascetic, Tamir became well known, and his reputation even reached the ears of his royal parents. Later in life, both the queen and king visited Tamir's hermitage, and upon hearing his preaching, they decided to renounce the world and become ascetics too. Not only the royal family, but also many other citizens of Kasi and 3 neighboring kingdoms followed their example. So this is the illustration of how the power of Dhamma practice, pursued to the degree of putting one's life on the line, can make real differences in life, and shows how the Bodhisattva never veered from his intention to attain Buddhahood and Nirvana, even when tempted by the comfort of luxury and power of royal governments. So this session I have introduced to you the blessing number 16 on Dhamma practice. My next live session online, which will, fingers crossed, be a week on Sunday morning, I'll move on to blessing 17, which is all about looking after one's extended family, which explains how to help a wider society without spiritually burning yourself out. For good measure, I would like to remind viewers that you can email your questions about meditation or what you've heard in this lecture to the email address that you have seen spelled out on the slide, and I'll do my best to answer these on my next session. In the meantime, try to stay healthy, avoid recklessness or complacency in the face of the virus, maintain a positive mood, speak only positive words, and forgive others. Extend good wishes to others, and meditate daily. Hopefully, as a result of today's session, you will be inspired to persevere in your Dhamma practice on all levels. So for today, this is me, Phra Nicholas Thanissaro, signing off for now. So long, folks, and stay safe.